Hello, my friends. My name is Scott Ritter, and in this update, I'm going to walk you through what's happening on the geopolitical chessboard, from the latest statements by Vladimir Putin and the stalled Ukraine talks, to the growing pressure on Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro, and the corruption scandals splashing both Kyiv and Brussels. We start in Moscow. The Kremlin has made it very clear that it is not considering a New Year's truce. Dmitry Peskov has stated that the fighting will not stop, that a ceasefire is not even on the table. According to him, the issue is not being discussed at all because a completely different process is underway. Russia is pressing its military advantage and trying to shape the terms of any eventual settlement from a position of strength. Against that backdrop, Vladimir Putin held a roughly 5-hour meeting in the Kremlin with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, envoys carrying a U.S. plan to end the war in Ukraine. That plan was presented 2 weeks ago and has been refined in consultation with the Ukrainians. The meeting was described as useful by the Kremlin, but Moscow insists that no compromise was reached on the core question of territory in Ukraine. Russia neither fully rejected the American plan nor accepted it. Instead, it did what it has done from day one of the special military operation: use negotiations to gain time while consolidating facts on the ground. From the Russian perspective, the baseline hasn't changed since the beginning. They are looking not for a standard ceasefire, but for something close to capitulation from Kyiv, formal recognition of Russian control over the territories it now occupies and perhaps those it intends to occupy. That's why the absence of a clear no from Moscow doesn't mean progress. It's just another turn of the wheel in a long process where Russia keeps advancing on the front line while diplomats argue over maps. On the ground, Russia continues its slow but steady campaign. There are claims of near total control over Pokrovsk still to be fully confirmed, and significant advances around other urban centers like Volchansk. Winter is approaching. Big sweeping maneuvers become harder, but Russia can still make incremental gains and, above all, maintain heavy bombardment of Ukrainian infrastructure to make the winter as painful as possible for the Ukrainian population. In that sense, nothing fundamental has changed. Russia pushes forward, Ukraine hangs on, and negotiations are used mainly to buy time and adjust narratives. The American plan, meanwhile, keeps bouncing between Moscow, Kyiv, and European capitals. It looks like a geopolitical version of Groundhog Day, U.S. Envoys talk to Putin, then go back to brief the Ukrainians, who adjust their position with European input. Then another round of talks is scheduled, and so on. We are still at the very beginning of any real negotiation process. Russia, which currently holds the battlefield initiative, has every incentive to prolong this phase so it can lock in more territorial and military advantages before weather and logistics slow things down. The logic from Moscow is fairly straightforward. Before the front freezes, literally and politically, it wants to wrap up several ongoing urban sieges and be able to announce, at least at the propaganda level, that a string of key towns are under firm Russian control. That way, when winter halts major maneuvers and the war moves into a more positional phase, Russia can claim that 5 or so major urban centers are now theirs. At that point, Moscow can shift weight back toward diplomacy, knowing that any future negotiation will start from that new reality. But when spring returns and the ground hardens, conditions again favor offensive operations. The big unknown is what shape Ukraine will be in by then. Kyiv is already facing severe shortages, not only in weaponry, but also in manpower. Morale has been hammered by casualties, corruption, scandals, and a growing sense of abandonment. Ukrainian refugee communities are protesting corruption and mismanagement. Many Ukrainians feel they are being told to fight to the last man by allies who are themselves losing interest. This is what Moscow is trying to exploit. Russia's broader objective is not just to take additional territory. It is to destroy Ukraine's remaining reserves, break the front, and force Kyiv into a position where it can no longer negotiate as a sovereign actor, but simply accept a Russian-dictated outcome. Western military advisors fear exactly this: a rupture of the front line, a deep Russian penetration, and then a Ukrainian collapse that turns any peace talk into a formalization of defeat. Europe, of course, wants to avoid a visibly decisive Russian military victory at almost any cost. European leaders know that if Russia can parade an undeniable success territorially and militarily, it will be a strategic and symbolic disaster for the EU and NATO. Hence, the tough rhetoric from Europe, the attempts to involve themselves more directly in the negotiation process, and the insistence that any settlement must address the issue of occupied territory in a way that doesn't look like outright surrender. That's the context for Putin's latest warning to Europe. He said, in essence, we don't want a war with Europe, but if Europe chooses to wage war on us, we are ready right now. If such a war begins, it could quickly create a situation in which there is no counterpart left to negotiate with. He contrasted Russia's surgical approach in Ukraine with how a conflict with Europe would look, and signaled that the tools used against Europe would be very different and far more devastating than the limited operations he claims to be using in Ukraine. Now, calling Russia's campaign in Ukraine surgical is, to put it mildly, debatable. A truly surgical operation implies precision in a limited space. What we've actually seen is a massive attempt at occupation and regime change that failed to achieve its maximalist objectives, but caused enormous destruction. Still, the rhetoric matters. Putin is now increasingly framing Europe, not the United States, as his primary counterpart and potential adversary. Meanwhile, Europe argues that it is Russia that is conducting hybrid warfare drones, suspicious ship movements, probing undersea cables near European waters, all meant to test defenses and political resilience. From the European view, they are not being aggressive. They are responding to a permanent probing threat. And the U.S. signal right now is telling Washington sent not its top political heavyweights, but secondary officials to recent NATO meetings. A way of saying, this is your backyard. You Europeans need to carry more of the burden. And within NATO, there have been statements about potential preventive strikes on Russian territory, highly provocative words from a senior officer. Putin's response is equally escalatory. Everyone knows that a full-scale conventional conflict between NATO and Russia carries a nuclear shadow. Russia's strategic posture is clear. Moscow will not allow itself to be defeated in a conventional war on its borders. If pushed to the wall, Russia will treat nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee, even if everyone insists that nobody will ever use them. That's why discussions about tactical nuclear weapons and local or surgical nuclear strikes are so dangerous. A tactical nuke, even at a local level, means the destruction of a city, a concentrated grouping of forces, or critical infrastructure. It is not something you can contain politically or morally. Once that door is opened, we are no longer talking about regional politics. We're talking about changing the trajectory of human history, with Europe at the center of the black hole. On top of the military tension, we have a wave of corruption scandals involving both Ukraine and the European Union. Federica Mogherini, former High Representative for EU Foreign Affairs, is under investigation for alleged misuse of funds. In Ukraine, high-level figures close to President Zelensky, like Andriy Yermak's circle, the energy minister, the justice minister, have been caught up in corruption probes and resignations. Some analysts emphasize that corruption is an endemic problem in all democracies. The difference is that in democracies, investigative journalism and independent prosecutors can at least bring scandals to light and force resignations. In a system like Russia's, by contrast, there is a narrow, privileged elite that captures most of the wealth while the population struggles. The corruption is no less real. It is simply less visible and less punishable. In Ukraine's case, it's important to note that anti-corruption bodies have acted, arrests have been made, top officials have been forced out. For a country at war, that responsiveness is noteworthy. The European Commission, in assessing Ukraine's candidacy for EU membership is watching these anti-corruption measures closely and making them a key condition of future integration. But we cannot pretend Ukraine is uniquely corrupt and everyone else is clean. Brussels is a huge center of lobbying and influence peddling. Money and interests from Morocco, Qatar, Azerbaijan, and many others flow through EU institutions. Many European politicians who end up there are not directly elected at the European level. Some are sent as a reward at the end of their domestic careers. Others are effectively parked in Brussels to cool down ongoing corruption investigations back home. You get a class of officials who are already compromised, then you put them into one of the biggest money and influence hubs in the world. It's not hard to see why scandals explode. Ukraine, for its part, has long been a playground of oligarchs and local strongmen. Figures like Rinat Akhmetov, who once bankrolled the Party of Regions in the Russian-speaking East, have shifted allegiances and now back Kyiv and Zelensky, becoming major private funders of the Ukrainian army and big beneficiaries of U.S. LNG flows into Ukraine via European ports. The same political structures that used to align with Moscow now profit from a Western-oriented war economy. Alliances shift. Money flows continue. These corruption narratives are now being weaponized in the context of negotiations. Pull up the carpets, shake loose the dirt, and you can use what falls out to steer talks in a direction you prefer. It becomes another lever, especially when public support for the war is eroding and taxpayers in Europe and the US are asking where their money is going. While all this plays out, Europe itself is facing security jitters. We've seen reports of a bomb threat in Mönchengladbach, Germany, around Bismarckplatz in the city center police cordons, evacuations of surrounding buildings, deployment of bomb-sniffing dogs, and disruptions to traffic and public transport. It's a reminder that even as we discuss high geopolitics, internal security tensions and anxieties are simmering inside Europe's own cities. Now, let's pivot to Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro, because Washington's attention isn't only on Ukraine. Donald Trump has escalated his rhetoric, speaking about imminent U.S. attacks on cartels operating inside Venezuelan territory after a recent boat operation in the Caribbean. He has warned of consequences for any country that produces or traffics drugs into the United States and has suggested that the U.S. armed forces are prepared to act on Venezuelan soil. From one angle, this can be seen as classic Trump, raising the stakes rhetorically to increase psychological pressure on Maduro, trying to fracture the ruling elite and encourage military officers to consider regime change. Trump promised his base he would not drag the U.S. into new foreign wars. So a large-scale land invasion of Venezuela would be politically risky. More likely are threats, covert operations, and perhaps limited air or special forces strikes framed as counter-narcotics or counter-terrorism actions. There is blatant hypocrisy at work. On one hand, Washington denounces the Cartel of the Suns and brands Venezuela a narco state. On the other hand, the U.S. has just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former Honduran president convicted in the U.S. for turning his country into a narco platform for trafficking and money laundering. You cannot credibly claim a zero-tolerance stance on narco politicians while rehabilitating one of the most notorious. The recent U.S. naval operation, where a boat was first attacked and then surviving occupants were allegedly bombed again, raises serious legal issues. Bombing survivors who are no longer actively engaged in combat edges into war crime territory under international humanitarian law. Families of victims, including at least one Colombian family, have already filed complaints with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Trump himself likely cares little about these legal niceties, and the U.S. traditionally refuses to accept international judicial oversight of its military operations. This is why the talk of surgical strikes in Venezuela is so dangerous. Even if limited in scale, they cross lines of sovereignty and legality and drag the U.S. military into morally and legally ambiguous operations. Still, it remains more plausible that we will see covert or limited actions than a full-blown invasion. The aim would be to raise the cost of ruling for Maduro, deepen splits in the elite, and make exile look more attractive. Meanwhile, there is growing speculation about where Maduro might flee if he steps down. Qatar, Russia, or Cuba are all mentioned. Reports describe a paranoid leader changing beds and phones constantly, acutely aware that enemies abroad and rivals at home are closing in. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has warned that a direct conflict between the U.S. and Venezuela would lead nowhere good, highlighting just how dangerous this brinkmanship is. From a structural standpoint, Maduro's resilience is remarkable. Handpicked by Chavez, he managed to consolidate control over the armed forces by granting them vast economic privileges, control over companies, access to revenue streams, and almost unchecked corruption. The military has been allowed to loot the country alongside the political elite, but that support is not unconditional. If U.S. pressure rises and it becomes clear that Maduro has become a liability, the same military might turn on him to save itself. There are even reports that an aircraft is kept ready near a Brazilian airport as a potential escape route, given that air corridors over the Caribbean are tightly controlled. A land route through Colombia or an air route via Brazil could allow Maduro to reach Cuba, which is arguably his most plausible destination. Cuban intelligence effectively embedded itself in Venezuela during Chavez's lifetime and has never left. Russia would be an odd choice for a man with a tropical temperament and limited appeal there. Qatar would complicate Doha's relationship with Washington. Cuba, already under U.S. sanctions and hostile to Washington, is the most logical bolt hole. Within the reported talks between Trump's team and Maduro's representatives, there are indications that the U.S. may have floated guarantees. If Maduro leaves and cedes power, Washington would refrain from seeking his extradition. That would allow him to settle in a friendly host country without constantly fearing arrest. Figures like Diosdado Cabello, another powerful regime insider, would likely be part of any negotiated exit package. Economically, Maduro's regime is running out of oxygen. Key revenue streams have been under systematic attack. Human trafficking across the U.S. border, with networks like the Tren de Aragua allegedly moving over 1 million people a year at $10,000, $20,000 per head, generating billions. Drug trafficking via Caribbean maritime routes, which became more important as land routes through Ecuador, Mexico grew riskier. Illegal, off the books. Gold production, another major source of unrecorded wealth used to enrich the elite and buy influence abroad, possibly even in Europe. As these channels are squeezed, Maduro's room for maneuver shrinks. Seeking refuge in Qatar or Russia would put those states on a collision course with the U.S. at a moment when they may not want that kind of baggage. Again, Cuba stands out as the least costly and most ideologically compatible option. And that brings us to the very latest development: new U.S. sanctions targeting individuals linked to the Tren de Aragua cartel, which Washington has designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Among those sanctioned is Venezuelan artist Jimena Romina Araya Navarro, known as Rosita, accused of assisting Nino Guerrero, the cartel's leader, including allegedly helping him escape prison years ago. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has moved to block these individuals from accessing the U.S. and global financial system. The stated intent under Trump's direction is clear: use every available financial and legal instrument to isolate these networks, cut off their money, and claim to be protecting U.S. citizens from terrorist threats. At the same time, these measures further tighten the noose around Maduro's ecosystem of support: his financiers, smugglers, and enforcers. So we end up with a world where Russia and the U.S. circle each other over Ukraine while Europe fears both Russian advances and American disengagement. Corruption scandals weaken public trust in Ukraine and the EU just as they try to hold a coherent front. Venezuela becomes a test case of how far Trump is willing to go in combining pressure, limited force, and back-channel deals to force regime change without openly dragging the U.S. into another large war. My name is Scott Ritter, and this has been my analysis of how these fronts connect. Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and Venezuela, all woven into a single fabric of power, pressure, and precarious negotiation.